Okay, does this look familiar by now? No. Okay, that was at Thanksgiving. Okay, what we've got here is a gene that's got something to do with depression. It's a gene that has something to do with the neurotransmitter serotonin. Details don't matter, they will come later. But the gene comes in two different flavors. And one version of it, based on everything that's known from laboratory animals, one version should be the kind that predisposes you more towards depression. So in this incredibly important study that was done a number of years ago, a guy named Caspi, Duke University, and colleagues, they had been studying 17,000 people basically from birth up to age 25 or so in New Zealand, and who knows why in New Zealand, but studying them there and following and asking, they took blood so they know the whole genetic profiles, and looking at, among other things, by age 25, does the person have major depression or not? Have they had an episode of depression? And now let's go look at which version of this gene they have. And what would everything predict from all the animal studies, which is you have the bad version of the gene and you're, as a human, going to have a higher chance of having a depression. That's not what the data looked like. Instead, it was one of those, it depends. It depends on the environment. What you saw was it all depended on how many major childhood stressors there were. Loss of a parent, divorce, abuse, some such thing. In the absence of any of those, this was the rate of depression in the people having the good version. And throw in one childhood trauma, two of them, three of them, and the incidence is going up slightly. Now, you've got the bad version of the gene, and it puts you more at risk only in certain types of environments. So here we have a great gene-environment interaction. That's something straight out of this one. You're saying, well, what does this gene have to do with the risk of depression? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on what your childhood environment was like. But now one additional detail showing that this is actually a case of this, one that just gets ignored whenever people talk about this study because it's cool, but it's actually not all that important. Okay, so here's the people with the good version of the gene, but it makes this point though. You got the good version and they're down here, and you know what's going to happen. The bad version is going to be exactly the same, but you look at the data closely, and in the absence, the bad version is actually a little bit protective from depression versus the quote good version. What have you just discovered there? It's one of these. This is a radical gene-environment interaction. Not only is it the case that does this put you more at risk? Well, it depends on the environment. Depending on your environment, it could put you less at risk. This one is not a big deal because there's a tiny difference. There's no reason to pay attention to it other than just sort of pointing it out pedagogically. But this is an amazing example where this can go in the opposite direction. This is a hugely important gene-environment interaction. So what all of this begins to set you up for is you've got this heritability number, and people come away constantly thinking about it's telling you about how much the average level of a trait is determined by genes. It's instead telling you how much the variability. What that means, thus by definition, that there's all sorts of nutty, counterintuitive things going on where earrings are totally heritable, a number of fingers are not. What that tells you is, by definition, the way experiments are set up to make things nice and clean and interpretable, scientists typically remove environmental variability. Scientists typically artificially have boosted up the seeming heritability of a trait. What does that tell you? The more different environments you study a trait in, the lower the heritability is going to be. Because you are going to be giving more and more opportunities for things to be different. There are more opportunities to be able to say, it depends. It depends on which environment. We've just studied it in 99 different environments, and it always looks like this, no difference by environment, and genes always make a huge difference. And then you go out, and before dying of fatigue, you study it in the 100th environment, and it now looks like this sort of thing. What you've just learned is this is a it depends example. The more environments you study something in, the lower heritability is going to be. Translating that into English, the more environments you study a genetically influenced trait, the less interesting and important the genes are going to be. The less interesting and important they're going to be in answering what does this gene have to do with whatever. And what we're seeing over and over again is the only way to answer it, or over and over again, it's going to be it depends on the environment. Ultimately, as I said a little while ago, ultimately it winds up being meaningless to ask what a gene does. Ultimately, the only really truly scientific way you can answer a question like that is, what does this gene do in this particular environment? People make this big deal out of, oh, genes do something, environments do something, and every now and then, hooray, they interact in some exciting way, and teaching the gene-environment interaction cliche, that's what's happening every single time. And that winds up being the basis of that quote from Paul Ehrlich in this department that I put on the handout, which is great, summarizes this entire point. Asking whether genes or environment have more to do with some trait is akin to asking whether height or length have more to do with the volume of a rectangle. They're inseparable. There's no such thing as a gene influence outside the context of an environmental interaction. Okay, let's look more at what this looks like. Here, this being one great example, and this being this iconic one, and this is a finding that is destined to be like the most important in the last quarter century in biological psychiatry. It is the most powerful demonstration in the realm of abnormal human behavior of what your genotype has to do with your behavior, the most amazing, logical, intuitively reasonable demonstration of it depends. It depends on how stressful the childhood environment was. Really great, bringing things back to last week's sort of molecular lectures, people already know who study this, the two different versions of the gene, certain classes of stress hormones interact with the two versions differently. When stress hormone levels aren't particularly raised, that difference isn't being manifested. The more of a history of stress, and it's obviously more mechanical, more complicated than just how much you're exposed to, but the promoters, the variation here is in the promoters. The promoters interact differently with those glucocorticoid stress hormones. In the absence of the glucocorticoid stress hormones, because in the absence of something exciting, the genetic difference makes no difference. So we've just translated an epidemiological answer. What does this gene have to do with depression? It depends. It depends on your childhood stress history. We've just translated that into last week's molecular biology. What does this genetic variance have to do with whether or not you have depression? It depends. It depends on how much childhood exposure to glucocorticoids you've had. So we've just leaped from analyzing this in the context of this field to translating that into last week and translating that into the endocrine lectures that are going to come next week, beginning to show, okay, you're an epidemiologist, the answer is what sort of environment? You're an endocrinologist, the answer is, well, the hormonal environment. Whether you define it, it's the same punchline, it depends. It depends on the environment. So this is the best, most amazing example of this in all of psychiatry. Except these guys, Caspi and colleagues, measured something else, and they got just as bestest of an answer for that, which is they looked at another gene that has variation, one we will hear about down the line, a gene called MAO, monoamine oxidase. All we need to know right now is a gazillion animal studies suggest that one version of the gene predisposes more towards aggression than the other. Whoa, so they got 17,000 people who've just had 25 years worth of opportunity to be aggressive or not, and they got the genes. And now they ask the question, rather than at age 25, has this person ever had a major clinical depression? Now they ask at age 25, has this person ever been in trouble with the law for some sort of antisocial behavior? Antisocial behavior is the new jargon for what used to be called sociopathic behavior. Has this person been in trouble with the law for sociopathic behavior, antisocial? And does it vary depending on which version of the MAO gene you have? And what you get is, not only is the answer, it depends, the graph is basically identical to this one. It's superimposable, the magnitude of the effect. What was this in that case? Whether or not you had, and how severe your child history was of abuse. The more childhood abuse you had, the more having the wrong version of the gene increased your odds of having antisocial aggressive behavior. Once again, a major dramatic it depends. And it's stunning. You look at these two different papers, both were published in Science a couple of years apart, landmark studies, all of that. And the two graphs really are virtually superimposable, the same magnitude of effects, the same answer. It depends on your childhood. So that is a very strong example. Next one, another one. Now you go back to this gene difference with the serotonin, the depression world, and now you study it in monkeys, and the variation there's variation in brain chemistry related to depression, all of that depending on how stressful the monkey's childhood was. Same exact sort of finding. What else? Now you begin to look at, going back to that world of dopamine receptors and thrill seeking and all of that, and what you look at there is variability in a certain type of different dopamine receptor gene, and what you find there is if you have a certain version of that gene, you have less social attachment. There's a whole psychology of how you measure that, and God knows why. It's associated with less social attachment if, and only if, you got brought up by a mother who was cold and withdrawn. There's once again it depends. By looking at that, it's nowhere near as clean as this, but it's the same sort of theme again. Another example of it, there's another gene called FAD2, and don't even ask me what it stands for, but which version of the gene you have has some predictability over your IQ. That's kind of interesting. It's not a big effect, but nonetheless it is demonstrable. Which version of that gene you have has some control, but there's it depends. Which version of that gene you have has something to do with IQ if and only if something. Let me tell you what this FAD2 is involved in. It is involved in carbohydrate metabolism. Carbohydrates, carbohydrate metabolism. It codes for some enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates and no doubt some certain kind. Okay, what's going on here? You've got two different versions of a gene that break down carbohydrates, and you got one version, and on the average you'll have a higher IQ if and only if some environmental thing was happening. Any guesses what that environmental thing might be? High carbohydrate diet, okay, that makes tons of sense. Yes, indeed, that winds up being relevant. Remember, you're now, not remember because I didn't say it already, but you're looking at IQ in kids, so you're looking now at carbohydrate stuff going on early in life, so frame it in that context. So we got a start of an answer here. So what else could be happening? If and only if the version you have of this gene that involved in breaking down carbohydrates, translating into how you're dealing with the amount of carbohydrates in your diet, gets you a different IQ with an if and only if. What would the if and only if be? Build on that comment there. What else could it be? Okay, I'm not even going to look. Somebody shout out an answer. You're right. Okay, who started? Somebody started saying something. Who started saying something? Okay. Any other ideas? Who said that? Look at that. They start pointing. The person doesn't even fess up. Who said that? You're right. Okay. You want to be that way? I'm out of here. Okay, so If and only if you read the damn notes, as it turns out. Yes, breastfeeding. Okay, breastfeeding. If and only if you are having a particular type of diet very early in life that is extremely rich in the types of carbohydrates that this enzyme works on. So a very dramatic if and only if there. I don't know why I write that stuff, or I don't know why I show up here. I should be doing one or the other and some sort of environment interaction thing. So yeah, breastfeeding. Okay, so one more example of very